So welcome to the panel where we're going to talk about I need 20 kilos in 6 months. How can I get this done? First, we're going to go through introductions, and then I want to get everybody's thoughts on this topic. Just open thoughts on it, and then we can get into some scenarios. So I will start. I'm Bob Hughes. I'm with W.R. Grace in South Haven, Michigan. We are a CDMO. Our facility is a fully GMP facility, and I've been in this field of process development for 26 years. Prior to Grace, the site was Albemarle, but prior to joining there, I was with Roche, Colorado, Pfizer, and Boehringer Ingelheim. Then I made the move over to the service side. So with that, move on to Ruslan.
My name is Ruslan Pryadun, and I am the president of AA Pharmacen. We've been around since 2006. We primarily focus on early stage discovery work, process development, and we sometimes get contacted when things don't go according to plan in manufacturing.
Hi, so my name is Shipp. I'm a digital CMC specialist at a company called QBD Vision. So we have a software solution for pharma and biotech manufacturing to help digitalize and manage knowledge across the drug development lifecycle. One of our primary use cases is streamlining scale-ups and technology transfers and reducing the time needed to collate, find, and share information between different sites and scales.
So my name is Raphael Vogler. I'm in the industry about 30 years, as well as my company Chemcon is out of Freiburg, southwest Germany. The company is taking classically the projects shortly before clinical phases are starting. So classically when we get a chemistry, maybe 10 grams or 100 grams are done, and our customer is asking for us to make a transfer to GMP and do an upscale, and I need it in shortest time frame. It's a challenge. We're facing the challenge of going from grams to multi-kilos more or less every day.
Yeah, hello, my name's Andrew. I'm from Raphael's Pharmatech. And we're an RSM manufacturer, process developer and manufacturer, so often, and for clinical stage assets. So often when demand for a clinical stage API goes up, and we get that sudden demand, we are often first out of the gate. So speed is definitely a relevant topic for us. So we can, it's a good topic for us.
Good morning. My name is Brandon Lee. I'm with Brototech. I am trained as a medicinal chemist, and Brototech does a lot of. We're essentially a CRDMO, so we take on a lot of medchem projects. And when the data looks good, they're ready for scale-up, and we support our colleagues all the way through the clinical trials. And some of the projects have gone into commercial manufacturing.
Good morning. My name is Roger Laforce, based in Switzerland. I've also been for over 30 years in the industry, like Raphael, and mainly went through first companies like Helsinn. They're also here. Then general manager at FIS Italy and CEO of ZAC System Italy. And then in 2014 I put up my own company, Laforce Business Solutions, where I'm helping suppliers and CDMOs to run the projects properly and also make sure that everything works out well with the customers. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, great. So this panel, we're going to completely wing it. We don't really have a game plan in place. We're just going to have a few talking points because this is so open-ended. And what I'm interested right now are first thoughts. When I first saw this topic, when I was invited to join this panel, it's like, really? 20 kilos in 6 months? This is probably, as a CDMO, one of those situations we don't want to be getting into, but it depends on a lot of different factors, right? What we typically will do is we'll have a desired timeline expressed to us. We look at the tech package, put our quote together, and we put our timeline in, what we think we can do. It may or may not align with this, and we normally do not see a timeline within 6 months. However, it could possibly be done. That's what we're going to get into. So the first talking point, the scenario is it's an existing customer. Okay, so somebody you've been working with. This is probably the best place to be if you get in a situation. But let's say you've made 5 kilos. And then they come back later on and say, we need 20 kilos in 6 months. Another thing, what does that 6 months mean? I'm interpreting that is starting in 6 months. If you include the actual manufacturing and release, that's going to be a pretty tight timeline. So anybody want to take that?
I'll start. Yeah, so when I got this topic, my initial thought was yes, but it depends. So 6 months based on our normal operations, let's say 6 months on delivery. It all depends on the chemistry, the technology. I mean, have we done it before? Do we know about it? The capacity, there's usually a business rationale behind it. And for Prototech, we really traveled down a journey with our clients. So there has to be more than just a date as a deadline. And so that's kind of how we approach it. Because that kind of dictates how much resources I bring in. And the more I understand your objective, the more I can justify the resources. So I'll leave it at that for now.
So I can share a real story that we've been engaged in. We've been contacted by a client who has been working with a CDMO on this route for a complicated molecule that had 4 chiral centers. And they reached out to us because they started running into some issues with reproducibility and the yield. And they needed to get to phase 1 tox 15 kilos in 6 months with the yields that were about 10%. So as we engaged on this project, what we realized was that not only did they have a problem with the route that they were using, they also had a problem with the polymorph. So they had a batch-to-batch variation where they and sometimes would make amorphous material, other times it would be crystalline, and their solubility was all over the place. So that was a bit of a nightmare to work through, but they didn't change the date. We did have to bring a lot of external help to do a lot of different tests and trying to get the material to come out consistently, to crystallize consistently, as well as improve a couple of synthetic steps. But some of the key learnings from that for them, I guess, was that you don't want to use speed at the expense of being thorough, because it will come back at some point in time and create a problem that is going to be more costly than whatever the savings that you think you're generating in the short run, in the short term. The process has been optimized and it's now, I believe, where it needs to be. But it was an interesting experience because there was a lot of stress, obviously, and a lot of difficult communication topics that had to be addressed.
So maybe I would like to add one point. What ChemCon is doing, and we have discussed this philosophy over and over, but we are still doing this. So when a project comes in, a project team is put together, and this project team out of mostly 2 to 3 PhD chemists and as well as lab technicians, the analytical team, they stay with the project as long as the project is in the company. Whether it's gram scale in the lab in the 100 milliliter flask, or whether it is upscaled, let's say in R&D still to a kilo or 2, or whether it turns in a GMP facility, and then maybe a 10 kilo lot is made, it will always be the same team. It has advantages and disadvantages that you do early stage as well as GMP manufacturing with the same people, because what's the experience? Is it rather on the smaller scale or is it on GMP? But one of the advantages is if you keep the same team, you don't have to make a transfer from one facility to the other or a transfer from one team to the other, and I think this is a philosophy that helps doing upscaling.
Yeah, I think it's an important topic. Talking about existing clients and existing products. Certainly, like the strongest correlation between success on scale-up is the amount of process development that you're doing prior to it. Scale-dependent studies. So, I mean, with an audience like this, there's probably a lot of experienced people in the audience, but I want to say something that's new, or at least something that helps reinforce something that you're thinking. But certainly, scale-dependent studies, they don't have to be done on very large scale, so you can do a lot of looking at parameters and variables in the lab. Doing multiple, iterating kilo lab demonstration batches, if you have time, right? Doing that prior to your first large-scale production certainly correlates really well with good first-time campaigns. One of the risks out there that you may not be aware of, sometimes if you're an API owner and you're going out, you're getting your API order in, and they're going in to order the RSMs, it's possible that your RSM is being produced on a one batch per stage campaign. So it's quite risky. If you've got a 7-8 stage process to make the RSM and you're doing one batch per stage, if things go wrong at stage 7, you've got a huge timeline problem. So it's something to be aware of. It's cheaper, of course, but I think if you're an RSM producer, you should be wary about that, and you should be talking with the API owner about that actually, and saying one batch per stage campaigns are not ideal. Probably I think a really good example, well, not really a good example, but like an example I can think of where we've been caught out. I can give an anecdote. We've been caught out on supply chain issues before. We've had an order for an RSM, and it was about 10x on the previous manufacturer. So it was the first time out of kilo lab, first time into plant. And we needed about 300 kilos of one of the raw materials. And our supplier was only able to actually, when it came to the crunch, our supplier was only able to deliver a few kilos per week. And we needed 300 kilos. So in this case, we didn't want to make it ourselves either. So that would be the default. We would try to just supplement and do in-house manufacture for ourselves. But in this case, we really couldn't. We went back to the API owner and said, look, there's really no supply of this raw material, and it's kind of our problem. It's kind of our fault. We should be looking at that. But the API owner, fortunately in this case, they knew another company that specialized in this type of material. It was a liquid product, so it needed liquid isolation technology that wasn't straightforward. And so they actually sort of helped coordinate us together and to make sure that we got delivered our raw materials so that we can make the RSM for them. So that was, about highlighting the problems early in terms of where that was happening. And the other thing I was going to say, I suppose I'm getting it all out in one go, but it was simple nitro aromatics. So or even if you've got an aniline or an amine, an aminopyridine or whatever. If there's a nitro group involved in there somewhere, then someone's doing a nitration somewhere. And if someone's doing a nitration and they don't really have the ability to scale that up, whether it's from a regulatory standpoint, or like an EHS standpoint, or just practically from their own scale, that can be a problem as well. And we have run into that problem before. And so we do run nitrations ourselves now, and we do it in flow, and we're ready to do it if we need to do it, because we don't really want to do a lot of nitration chemistry. Nobody does. But if we can't get, sometimes a first-time scale-up, we're going out shopping for that nitro compound, the original supplier says, actually, we can only do 5 kilos. So then you really have to be early thinking about simple nitroaromatics. It may not be transparent, it may not be visible that actually the supply of that compound is actually very limited, and you need to be looking at that early. So I think the API owner, if you're a biotech company or a pharma company and you own the API, it's okay to let the API manufacturer look for RSMs and look for materials, but I think as the owner, you still should take full ownership right back to the things that, the commodity materials that you can find.
Yep. Maybe I would to put into the focus of the discussion also here the word how. Because as you said, also the one point is that who is your customer? I have seen very often that if it's a big pharma company, they have their own chemical R&D, then it's maybe easier because you're talking more or less at the same level. If it's maybe a biotech company and they need the API or the compound and they don't have any idea really about what it takes to develop and scale up a compound, since they are maybe more in the clinical business and so on. Some companies even have the idea that any compound is just ready away from the shelf, So on the how, one first thing, and these are all experiences I made in my different functions, and now also working with several principals and customers, is at the beginning to choose the routes. So the route, if you already have a defined route from the customer, that's one thing, but very often you don't have that, and then first you need to go into databases and figure out maybe the potentially best routes. And what we usually did with one company is then to come along with 2 to 3 options, discuss it with the customer, and then choose together the potentially best ones, and then started working on these. And I have to say, 6 months, 20 kilos, in that case, was not something scary. We did it. The other point is, and that's maybe also a question to the panel and to you guys out there, by the way, please also contribute to the discussion, ask questions. I imagine when you're in the lab, mostly is manual work, right? What about you guys? Oh, okay. When you go to the kilo lab, again, pretty manual. When you go to the pilot, how many of you have automated pilots? Hands up. Nobody. Okay. There I.
Running Emerson DCS at
Okay.
least.
Good. There I have a case. By the way, it's a Chinese company. They have a fully automated pilot plant, non-GMP. And what they do is mainly they figure out the routes, define the recipe, and then they run it through the plant. They have very good data logging, so they have the data, they can see what went wrong, what went well, and then they do again. So they run it several times through the system, and that way, in one case, we succeeded in getting the 20 kilos in 3 months then, but it was a 4-step synthesis, so that's the other point. So the question would therefore also be, how could we today start using more automation in the scale-up process? And then second, and that's maybe, it's a great word today, artificial intelligence, but there are already activities underway at the moment, maybe more at academic level, to combine route selection with kind of artificial intelligence. I think IBM has also developed a system which is really accessible, RX, or I don't know how it's called. I don't know how good it is, but I tried it for a few compounds, and it gives you retrosynthesis, forward synthesis, and comes along with several options. So I would say, what are your views then on how to change or what could we introduce to accelerate scale-up work? And I think you are very much into data and data management, right?
Yeah, so for me that's a very interesting point, and I think it almost goes back to the point that Raphael made earlier about having the same team. One of the advantages, you keep the team consistent, but it's also you remove the need to transfer the knowledge between different teams, different environments, which, given the way that we all work in documents, spreadsheets, disconnected systems, is a real bottleneck for scale-up, I think. Because it's very difficult to actually see into that information and compare it between the different sites, different scales, different environments. If it's all inside documents, it's unstructured. So keeping the same team is essentially centralizing your knowledge inside of people. The company that I work for, we centralize the knowledge inside of a software solution. But it's the same principle. It's avoiding that need to transfer anything, keeping it consistent throughout, keeping the people with the expertise and the knowledge on the project so that they can navigate all of the pitfalls. They know where all the information is. They know what it means. They understand the context. So when we do go to a different environment, it's like, okay, we understand this. We've been on this project since day one. It's pretty easy for us. Whereas somebody new coming in, and I think this goes back to this ideal scenario of having an existing customer, you've already established a way of working. You know them, the relationship is there. You've worked with them before to already make some material. So that transfer of information to you then with an existing customer should be pretty defined. But I think we'll probably get into this a bit later. A new customer, for the very first time transferring something over, you spend a very long time just going, okay, what does this mean? Why do you want to make 20 kilos in 6 months? Why? So, yeah, I think there's definitely something we can do with regards to information to accelerate scale-ups for sure.
Yeah, go ahead, question.
I think on that last point, what's the panel's feeling then on maintaining impartiality and objectivity when you're doing tech transfer into a GMP production, maintaining the same team all the way through? Where does that continue to go, or does it, in your experience, is there a bottleneck?
Yeah, that's a difficult transition to make, and we at Prototype have a slightly different philosophy about that. Well, first of all, if you don't have a synthetic route, that's a really difficult position to start to talk about timeline. So we usually have some kind of synthetic route to start with. Whether or not we can change it to something away from a nitro intermediate, that's something that should be a judgment call by us and by the client ourselves. But when it comes to transfer, we actually have our small scale team, pilot plant team, and then eventually to manufacturing team. They are separate teams. When there needs to be a technical transfer, the team travels with the project to the plant for a month or two or however is needed. And if the process is so difficult to the point where we cannot make that transfer with the people and the knowledge, there may be issues about potentially even a bigger scale up. So there's the documentation aspect. The chemistry needs to be repeatable in multiple scale at different level. And so that, the small scale gram chemists cannot be trusted to go to a 3-level reactor because those reactors are maintained very differently, and bench scale chemists, I would not be comfortable with that, or I trust myself to do the maintenance and cleaning. And they know their instrument much better. And so that's why the transfer has to be, it's done by teams, and the personnel and the knowledge goes with it, depending on the site that we choose.
I mean, I'm aware that it has advantages and disadvantages to maintain the team. Absolutely. And that it's maybe a position of, let's say, the scale. And if you have a 3-level reactor, that's maybe something else. Then, I mean, for us, the maximum reactor capacity is something between 400 and 600 liters, which is still something which is not so far from the lab. But if you're talking about thousands of liters reactor volume, it may be different. And I know it has advantages and disadvantages, absolutely. But I would like to add maybe a new point to the discussion. So about 10 years ago, for safety and security reasons, we had to add reaction calorimetry measurement with our reaction. And we did this at the beginning because we had to. You know, our safety constraints from the German TÜV says over 100-liter reactors, look at your reaction calorimetry, what can happen, does it heat too much? And what we learned is, because we have invested in that piece of equipment and we have it in-house, and what we have learned, it's much more than a safety. You learn very much about your chemistry if you look very thoroughly what happens. And what we added to this experience is not only reaction calorimetry, and it's not only the synthesis team. What we now really try to do with each and every reaction which gets upscaled, have the team sitting of the synthesis people and the analytics people to see, is the reaction maybe over in 10 seconds, or does it take 3 days? And the analytics of that, when is the reaction done, or when is it overdone with reaction calorimetry, within process controls, that's super valuable information to say, okay, try to mimic what has happened in the small 100 milliliter flask and do copy that in a 400 liter reactor and understand the reaction. Just don't only do it, but understand it with as much in-process control as possible. And this is only working when you have the analytics in-house, in place, and when the analytics team and the production team works very close together.
Yes, I'd like to echo this point, especially with respect to route scouting and making sure that you have a robust route before you start going into scale up. And at least in our experience, and we mostly deal with difficult molecules, at the current state of development, retrosynthesis that's generated by SciFinder or Reaxys or any other software packages is just not useful whatsoever. And there are reasons for that. Some of that has to do with the fact that it's not a linear combination of transformations that you're dealing with. So sometimes what deep expertise helps you do is to generate insights that simply previously are not in the database. Therefore, the algorithm cannot find something that is not there. And that's what the benefit of the experienced chemist truly is. It's not finding previous precedents, but generating new precedents based off of what's already known, and then applying it towards specific objective. And second point is understanding your route through and through, and that can be done very early on, so that when you do go up to scale up, you have a certain expectations and you're able to monitor and predict what it is that you expect to observe, and then based on that, you can see how much control you have over the process. And that investment of time will pay for itself in spades later on.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in here.
No, go ahead.
Because the next question is gonna kill off the rest of the hour, I guarantee it. I just wanted to give a few thoughts on the first scenario. From my perspective, first I want to mention team. I think it's really important for team maintenance, not only for the project, but also the customer relationship. You always like to have that same interaction. So at a minimum, we're going to keep the lead chemist on a project. And for us, that team is responsible for overseeing the process when it's in the plant. So they do the lab development, and then they're responsible for the coverage when it's in the plant. So the first scenario I mentioned, you already have experience with the product. And to me, it was kind of a low-hanging fruit question, because for us, it's no problem. If we made 5 kilos, we can scale it up to 20. One catch is raw material availability. Michael here is going to support me on this. We do have some raws that take longer than 6 months to make. And so that's something else that has to be kept in mind. So the next question is new customer. So they come to you with a tech package, and we've already kind of hit on that a little bit, but it's a brand new customer, and they absolutely have to have you start in the plant within 6 months. So I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I think I'll just I'll add mine at the end, but I want to hear what everybody has to say. So we've talked about new routes, and I think that's kind of out of the question in this situation. So it has to be an existing route, but there's so many scenarios that you can think of here. So let's have at it.
Yeah. I think there are when you develop routes or when you work in the lab and so on, there are hard data you can have, temperature, how is temperature going, even the reaction calorimeter, you can get the hard data. And then there are the soft data. And we discussed this also 2 days ago in a CDMO workshop here, where Jim Bruno said, there are things maybe that slip out of your attention when you run something in the lab. Maybe that solution turns slightly yellowish. Maybe that information then goes lost. Or maybe a little hiccup in the temperature, calorimetry again, and things like that. So my question would also be, with the data logging system today, how is it possible to catch these more soft information, which very often are crucial then to the whole process? Maybe there is a impurity formed, and then we discover it, of course, when you do the analytical, but then it may be already too late.
So sometimes we take a video of the reaction, actually time-lapse video, when there are both turbidity changes and color changes, and that could be helpful. Obviously, then data storage becomes an issue, but it can be a solution within specific contexts.
Yeah. Raphael, you're agreeing, it seems.
I mean, you raised a very interesting point, and I think you're right. Maybe I would like to add a little more experience when you say it's a new customer. He brings his chemistry in. What my experience is, he says, at my lab it worked. And then suddenly we come up with HPLC to look on impurities, which the customer has not even done before. He has seen in his NMR, the molecule was there, no doubt. And to get the molecule is easy. But to get the molecule in the desired purity, that it is GMP, that's the one challenge. And I have to say, when getting a new chemistry from the customer, it's always a challenge to discuss with him when we add the necessary analytics, the HPLC that really looks at it, the gas chromatography for residual organics and so on, to say, yes, you had the molecule and we are having the molecule too, but what's now with assay and purity? It's a huge story.
That's really, we're talking about chemistry.
Yeah.
We can't forget about the analytical side. These days, our analytical group, they can be buried with, like you said, impurity identification, developing methods. So we always have to keep that piece of the puzzle in mind. Can analytical satisfy that same timeline?
I mean, we've inherited programs where they've shared an HPLC, it's a nice single view. Our analysts get to work on it and suddenly it looks like polished. So, I mean, to answer
Exactly.
if this came to Curia, I would look at where has this work been done.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, the quality of work coming in, at least in my experience over the past 10 years, there's a serious lack of ethics in some places. So we would say, hey, we are not committing to anything until we run a familiarization. It may be a small batch, but we need to reproduce that chemistry.
Right, and then there
Learned a lot of times.
Yeah, then there are some mid-sized companies that we're very familiar with large process groups, and so you're going to put more trust in that chemistry as opposed to a much smaller outfit where you don't know where the chemistry originated.
Yeah. Look for a company that has like CMC team. Makes your life a lot easier. Otherwise, expand that window as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely depending on what kind of routes or process you're already getting from the customer, and sometimes customers are a little bit reluctant to give you the full know-how from the very beginning. So you have maybe sometimes to reinvent the wheel, which costs time. So I think communication is another point which is extremely important between the customer and I don't talk about the sourcing person, but really the technicians, the lab people. I always saw when the chemists and the technicians from both parts, so from us and from the customer side, in a certain sort, fell in love with each other, not in a romantic way, of course, then communication was always very good. And that's one point. The other point is in every development and scale up, you have hiccups and bumps in the road. Of course, today in project management, you have weekly meetings, whatever. But I have very often seen that maybe senior chemists came to me, or sometimes also the production manager, and said, Roger, here we don't have good phase separation, it's still turbid, it should be, both solutions should be clear. What do you think? I was thinking, take another week and try to fix the problem. And then we can still call the customer if it doesn't work. I told him, look, let's call him directly now and explain that we have a problem. Apollo 13, of course. And then, maybe not that bad. But we did it, we called them, customer was a US customer, and they were happy that we called him and told him we had a problem. And then we figured it out together. Similar experiences?
Yeah, I mean, we're all saying similar things, but yeah, once you, in the sense that, once someone comes to you for the first time and they've got a product and it's something like 20 kilos, yeah, the first question is, where did it come from?
I think to answer what he said, once we start sharing our experiences and what we are finding and reproducing, we build more credibility.
Yeah.
Because they know we are doing right by the program. To
Yeah.
give you guys an example, we inherited a program where the tech package said the chemistry has been done on a 10 kilo scale. What they didn't tell us was they had done it on 10-gram scale with hundreds of batches. But they reproduced it on the tech package said it was 1 lot.
That's not scale
Yes,
up.
I've seen that too. The final lot's big.
So that's where the quality of the data comes in.
I mean, ideally you want a batch record from whatever previous make. If it can be redacted, when it comes to communication around MSAs and CDAs, and if an API owner has a product and they want 20 kilos made and they can't share that much information, I mean, the best thing is whatever, even if it was a kilo lab run, but it was a batch record, it's been redacted, at least you can see timescales. You want to see real timescales in there, not just materials and equivalents and volumes. But yeah, I mean, I think you covered a good point about familiarization. I mean, I was a chemist for a long time in the lab. Like, I'm not just going to rock up to the kilo lab and run something based on a document. So you'll be doing familiarization in the lab first. And then, as a tip, if you're going into a kilo, you can do a lot in, not even in a kilo lab, in a 2-liter jacketed lab reactor, but running at process relevant timescales for large-scale equipment in terms of mass transfer and times, and you can simulate most of that in a 2-liter reactor. So then you can just gather the data, and you should be disciplined about it too. If you do go into a kilo lab, write your batch record as it's going to run in the plant, run it in the kilo lab, stay disciplined and run it to those timescales and to those parameters that simulate plant conditions and see what you get. Because they're actually running scale down concept of your plant, and then you'll see what you're really going to get, and then you'll reveal those problems. But it's it is like turning over you're turning over variables and parameters and turning over all those stones, trying to reveal all the potential pitfalls that could happen on your scale up. It's kind of impossible to do all of them. Like if you take a single stage and you actually list out all the variables, it'll be more than 100 probably per stage. But you do risk assess those and go for the high ones first. Take the biggest bite out of the sandwich first, get rid of those biggest question marks around scale dependence, and then you probably, then the probability that something happens in your scale-up is reduced.
If I just add one thing, if you, in the situation that you've described, I can't recommend more highly to actually speak to the companies that actually did the work, because to your point, if there was some funny business going on, you would be able, and you have insightful questions and you do your homework, that would be something that you'd be able to catch right off the bat, and then you wouldn't have to spend 3 months banging your head against the wall. Why doesn't this work? So talking and trying to understand the depth of their knowledge, what they did, how they did it, why do they see what they see, would be saving a lot of time in the long run.
There was a question about the gentleman in the blue shirt. Did you have a question?
Me?
Yeah, did you have a question?
I had another example. I was involved in a project from a biotech company in the US. Anti-cancer product, pre-phase 1. They needed about 40 kilo per key intermediate, 40 grams. And we got, the process was developed by a research institute in the US. And there was a tech transfer to the CMO, to the new one, because the existing one couldn't scale up. So the new one, we said, okay, we can do that. The 10 steps are very, very complicated. Last three-step GMP, the previous steps, no GMP. We can do it by 6 months. So he took over that process, and it didn't work at all. It was developed, but it didn't work at all. So there were a lot of hidden, tech package. You don't get all the information. There's some fine tuning, which is not written in the tech package. That caused them a delay of about 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of the 6 months, they had 12 months to make the 4 grams of that key intermediate. But finally, they could. They had to redevelop the process because some of the intermediates they were difficult to isolate. They were gummy, so that was very, very difficult. And but finally, they succeeded in making the 12 months.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's pretty common for the desire for speed ends up taking even longer. And it's always our recommendation, give us the time to understand the process, to fully develop crystallizations, isolations, and it might take more than 6 months. It will, I would imagine, but then we deliver.
But only the fact that then the customer, the existing supplier, he wasn't very keen on giving more information because the biotech companies, he said, whenever he calls the existing manufacturer, he would charge him for that information. So it was very difficult to get all the information out from the
Yeah. So yeah, we have similar experience like this. So that's why we have a trust but verify philosophy about this, coming from taking over chemistry from other labs. And communication is very important, but talking to too many people costs too much time too. So we look at the calendar and we look at delivery date, and we've had projects where we have bi-weekly communications to monthly, and towards the end we were having like every other day we were sending updates. So they know exactly when things are going. They know when the products are getting drummed, when they're getting to the ports, when they're getting shipped out. This is the only way that you have that clarity from everybody on the project team that you actually will meet that deadline. We cannot, have that kind of goals established. It's very easy to run out of time very quickly.
Yeah, the other point is, I think, if it's really not feasible, even if you see it at the beginning, you need to be honest and say, it's not feasible. Excuse me, but 6 months is too short. We can't do it in 6 months. Because very often at the customer side, they have certain pressures, of course, because they have to maintain their clinical programs, and every day lost is maybe $1 million, they say. But I think in every project also there are some buffers. So there it's very important to be realistic, and then maybe also not properly maybe turn down, but say, realistically seen from our end, it takes 8 months, for example, you know. And then if you still can deliver in 6 months, the customer is even happier. So it's all about also open and clear communication for that, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting that although we've talked about a lot of different examples, there is a common thread throughout all of this about how information and knowledge is shared between the CMO and the sponsor, between the scales within the CDMO and between the other teams. So we've talked a lot about communication. We've also talked about the quality of information that the CMO receives, the quality of the tech package. Hey, we'd really like to see a batch record, right? And we've also talked about teams moving with projects to ensure that that knowledge is retained and not lost as the project evolves. So it's very interesting that even though we're speaking about individual technical activities, that theme of, well, how can we do it in 6 months? Well, one of the key enablers of that is the communication and sharing of information. And I think that's really key. It's your access to it, the ability to find it, search it, and then leverage it to actually achieve the speed with good quality because you have an understanding of the information. So even though we're sharing examples throughout the panel specifically, and I know you have a lot of thoughts on this too, so I'll pass it over to you. I think the theme of actually managing the knowledge, if we can do it in 6 months, I think that would be key to achieving that timeline, personally.
So I would like to get back to what you just said. So we get approached on a regular basis with customers that are having timelines, and my sales boss is very often in the situation that he says, yeah, I understand that you would like to have your material in 6 months from now, but it is a tough thing to tell him that's not feasible, it's not going to work. And the realistic timeline may be 9 months or maybe even 12 months. And we see customers move away because they don't want to hear that. In a few times it happened that I got this customer after 2 years and I said, you went to the other guys, did they make it in 6 months? Nah, you know. So I think it's really very important to see whether the timeline of the customer is realistic or how soon you have to tell him that it's maybe not really realistically possible, or that you're taking risks. A risk is, okay, if you do the upscale only once or do, you know, the scale up in the clean room facility, it's a risk of failure. And this is also something that you have to discuss with your customer, and the customer classically says, oh no, that's on you. I mean, you're here the CDMO, you're here the expert, and I rely on you, but I want to have the guarantee of, you know, this development work. It's a huge discussion what we have, and taking the customer back to reality, I think it's a big task. Exactly what you say, Roger.
Absolutely, yeah.
And just to add to what you just said, we've had that same experience many a time. They go to another competitor, but then they get their hands burned. They come back.
They come back.
They turn out to be your best customer.
Yeah.
Because they buy everything you're selling at that time because they know you were right at the first time.
I think there was a question there.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight the relevance of this question, right? So, I work for many biotechs, and so as a biotech company, right, you're funding the next milestone. Very common, right? Maybe GLP batch, first in human batch, but you know, after 10 patients of data with your drug, you might find this is curing cancer, right? And so the next task is, okay, what's our path to NDA, of course, right? And registration. And so this 20 kilo request is very real. It's probably more prevalent in biotechs, right? Because we're very capital limited, focused on milestones. A company that can mobilize the resources required to deliver 20 kilos is going to be winning in that setting every time. And the money, just to be clear, the money available once they've demonstrated early POC, that's not the question. It's how quickly you can mobilize Stefan's chart of all the biotechs, the little bubbles, right? There's a lot of bubbles out there, and they have a lot of good science, and they're funding to the milestone. So I think the frequency of these requests is only going to go up, and it may be make or break for them, right, to achieve it. So I just would say this is a very relevant question, and probably resource mobilization for me is the biggest challenge once the spigot's turned on.
Right. And I think a lot of us CDMOs, and it depends on the synthesis too. We haven't talked about how many steps.
30 steps.
Yeah.
30 steps. Not
You know, so I'm going to stick with 4 steps. So I think we could execute. It's the risk. And that's what the sponsor has to understand. Without that process knowledge, scaling, and it doesn't have to be 20 kilos, it could be 10 or 5 kilos. Because to me, that's real, you're in the same situation. But I'll give you an example that my last hands-on project, I think we were about 10 months into the pilot plant. It was a process developed by a US-based CRO. The chemistry is in pretty good shape. We could have scaled that up within 6 months successfully. But we took the time to get that full process understanding, understand impurity formation, and so at the end we had a much better package. But you know, we're not up here saying we can't do it. It's just we emphasize the risk.
So, like real example here, and it's funny, right? Because we were just betting last night, right? And so, real example, I selected multiple producers to do the development manufacturing, and I had them collaborate in the development setting. And so, ultimately, everybody is transparent, full transparency. Obviously, you think maybe that never worked, right? Nobody's going to agree to talk to each other, competitors. It wasn't a problem. We had weekly calls on process development. We shared understanding between the sites. We adopted best practice and just killed it. We also, we played our 2 bets, right? We played 2 bets and both came in. And so it was a pretty remarkable, achievement. It's definitely a challenge, right? The money's there for the biotech. I think it's coming forward and saying, here's the best plan on how I can bring this all together and make it a possible scenario. Part of it's brute force chemistry. Let's be clear. We all do that. Right? We all do that. It's not pretty. But part of it, in the background, you have to do the developments to make it robust.
I think there is a question at the back, isn't there?
Several questions.
Yeah, it's a good few questions. Go.
Yeah, speaking as a sponsor, sometimes we only know what we know, especially if we're transferring into a CDMO for the first time. Because we have a data package, we think it's robust, but again, not all analytical labs are created equal, coming from CROs to each other CRO. And then I think what we try to do is rely on the CDMO's expertise to say, yes, we can get there, or no, we can't. But tell us why we can't, because then we have to be able to pitch back to our senior leaders who are, dependent upon these milestones to answer to the board and say, why can't we meet that timeline? So we rely on you and your expertise to say, yes, with this particular process, we could probably do it, but it's risky, as you mentioned. But if you gave us a little bit more time, we could have a very solid package to be able to move forward with. But I think we rely on your expertise to say why we can't get it done by a certain period of time. If you have examples that you can bring to the table and say, yes, based on our experience in this similar project, we ran into these kind of issues. So we think it might happen in this particular case. We don't know, but just based on our wealth of knowledge, we can add this color to descriptions why you can't do it. And then what that does, it helps us couch and present the information up our chains to say, all right, the CDMOs are saying it's going to take 9 to 12 months in order to get to this target. Can we live with that? Is there much wiggle room in the corporate timeline to meet that goal? And whether or not the CDMO that we choose to go with, or CDMOs, if you're going to do multiple campaigns, different companies, to see who gets there first, it gives a more realistic picture, and you couch that with all of the risks that are associated with it, and then they're able to make a decision based on the risk profile. Let's go with this. We understand the risk. Let's continue to move forward. If we want to push for the 6 months and deal with all of the issues that may be present, that's an educated decision. So having all that information available, I think, is really key, and where the young sponsors rely on the expertise of these well-established CDMOs to bring to the table so that they can educate them as they go through the process.
I think that's a very good point. I'll let anybody else who wants to.
There are more questions. Yeah. Please.
So since this is the first 20 kilos in 6 months, and I'm guessing that these kind of projects, particularly for CDMOs who are dealing with new chemical entities or new products, will have a challenge in scaling up in the first campaign itself. And there is a very widely used term in India, I don't know whether that's a global term or not, we call it OTIF, on time in full, which is the demand of the client, and we've spoken in length about the timelines. And being in this business, I realized the hard way that the first campaign will fail either in on time or in the full quantity because of the reasons. And even a harder way, we realized that if you deliver it in OTIF, you're going to bear a loss on that product because of so many reasons. So this is a very interesting question I want to ask, and I want 2 point of views, particularly from the business development side of things and maybe the technical side of things. What are the specific risk mitigation factors a company could implement while you're scaling up these 20 gauges in the first 6 months, and which might, save you from all of these OTIF and losses and the other things which we've come to know in the harder way of things?
Yeah, I might just say something from a kind of technical standpoint. Yeah, I mean, scale dependence, yeah, you can simulate so much in the lab. You can simulate so much just by giving it the worst possible conditions or I mean, distillation, extending distillation times, simulating long distillation times or long distillation paths in the lab, just through experimentation, through repeated distillation, or you fit a Dean Stark and you overflow it back in, and then you just keep it running for a long time. Mixing, so you're trying to simulate the plant as much as you can in the lab early on. You're not using much material, and you can do it pretty quick, and not taking things to the end. You don't have to take a reaction to an endpoint to make a decision about whether this is actually the same. If it's moving up the curve in the same way, it's probably going to be the same. So you don't have to run everything out as well. You can do a lot of stuff in parallel. You get enough material to start things, and you can run multiple stages in parallel, looking at how things are moving when you start to simulate plant simulation to try and do it quickly. But yeah, there's no substitute for doing a lot of experiments, and simulation. I don't know about software. It's been a long time since I've used software to try and simulate, plant conditions, but that may be another option as well that people could use. And then, yeah, being realistic with when you're doing quotations, usually there's an overage of raw materials. There's an excess that you put in. Maybe be transparent to your client about that and say, look, we're actually going to order 1.2, 1.3 times raw materials. We're not putting a margin in for raw materials, but we're going to order this excess, and it's going to be in there. So we might end up being a bit over. Would you take that material if it's over? So then you've got, as a supplier, you've got to, if you accidentally make excess, you've got a way to ship that material to them as well. Or they might say, no, that's not enough. Can you order 1.5 times, just in case? Can you order double? So depending on how you've been communicating with your client and what you collectively believe is the risk for this first-time scale-up, to try and avoid the situation where you're, 5% below what they need, and you have to run a second campaign, which is kind of the worst-case scenario. Yeah.
Okay, we're up against our hour.
Yeah. Last comment is that I would say communications is the key to the big picture concern that you pointed out. There's always more details, and hopefully there's not another COVID that kind of squeeze your timeline even more, because we literally had shipments going out on the last plane out of China. So, yes, timeline is important, it's real, and not everything we can control, so.
So my extension of this question is to all the business development and business officers on this panel. And have you guys ever tried that the first campaign which is pitched to the client during the pre-sale stage is not on the final quantity and maybe on the consumption of the raw material, which saves you from the fact that this is the first campaign and we are getting to know the tech pack or modifications to the tech pack along with you, because the client knows as much as you know maybe when you start the campaign. So does that work in this field? Is that a kind of a practice which do the clients take that, accept that?
Not in my experience. I do. I mean, I'm the BD, but I rely on the quoting on my technical team, and the price always gets better as over time, as scale goes up, or as we get to know the process better.
Okay.
I'm trying it, of course. It depends then on the customer, their expectations or attitude. I think there is always, and that's again the soft factors, room for discussion, and you just have to ask the question, and if you get a no, then you get a no, and otherwise you can go forward.
Yep. Great. We got another panel coming in at 10, so I want to thank the group here.